All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Istio Networking Community Meeting. We will dedicate this meeting to network scoping theme in general. So we have a proposal to review, and there are a few issues that are in this area. Okay, but before we start, I would like to make a short announcement in case people missed the emails I sent about the traffic governance survey. So there is a form in which we're kindly ask you to review a short example of configuration for traffic governance. So there are two proposals, and we would like to know your opinion. So if you could please spend 5 minutes or more to read it and understanding and indicate your preference, it would be great. So I will probably review the results in the next networking meeting. That's in about 2 weeks. But it would be great if you could answer by the end of next week. Okay, thank you. All right, and also I think Rafael, I'm not sure if you already joined. You added a last-minute item about a demo, Istio multi-cluster on OpenShift. And I'm not entirely sure we will have time to cover it. And I also think this is better suited for the network, the environment meeting. So I wonder if it's okay to do your demo next week at the environment meeting.
I think both.
Okay, he's here.
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah, I'm not familiar with the other meeting. If you can send me the.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. So yeah, it's also like it's pretty much the same attendees, and we also record those meetings. We post them on YouTube. So yeah, in case we have time, we can definitely, we would love to see it. But I have a vague feeling we won't be able to get to this.
Okay, that's
all
fine.
Right. Thank you. Thanks for understanding. Yeah. So for the network scoping theme, Louis will present his proposal and document. The link is in the meeting notes. So
yeah, let me.
Louis.
What's the ID?
Okay. So it's
yeah, I can
okay. XJJ-UJHI-QFK.
So unfortunately, there were a lot of meeting comments added to the doc yesterday. I did not have a chance to review those. I was in meetings all day yesterday, but we can go through them here. But it's probably useful to give everyone a kind of high-level overview of what is what we're covering here. Some of the motivations behind this, which hopefully I captured in the doc, but it's probably worth discussing them generally. And also some aspects of the general direction that this doc is taking the product. So we have a big problem today, right, with big meshes that because we don't understand scoping or contextual usage, right, we have to deliver the configuration for every service that is within the mesh to every envoy in the mesh. Right, so we end up with this big n-squared configuration delivery problem, and we've, hobbled along getting Istio to work in that mode with, up to about 3,000 services, but it's painful and it's slow. It's a real problem with node startup time. It's a real problem with system reliability, and we need to do better. And we have feedback from a number of adopters saying that they're more than happy to declare what the dependencies of a given workload are, right? And that usually means either a pod or a deployment or a namespace. They're willing to say at that level of granularity what services in the network that they consume. And so we have a feature in here called Egress, which is basically a way for a namespace owner to say, here are these set of services that I'm going to take a dependency on. Right, and there's some filter logic that allows you to be either fairly loose about how you make that specification or very precise. And that's the egress block. Similarly, an effort somewhat at symmetry, I added an Ingress block into this API, and really that Ingress block is just a strawman example of some refinements to the Istio RBAC policy, right? And Istio RBAC policy applies on workload ingress, right, when traffic comes into the sidecar, which Lee Min was working on anyway as part of a simplification and rationalization of Istio RBAC policy, and also an extension to RBAC policy to make ordering explicit so we could support grant and deny, right? Now, we can debate the general structure of the API, and I think there's some feedback in the doc, maybe from Spike, about whether these two things belong in the same resource or not. The only reason I put them in the same resource is it somewhat structurally mirrors what's available today in Kubernetes network policy, right? It has an ingress and egress definition for the workload binding. Now, the egress rules today, right, because of some of our existing implementation issues, can't really be considered an egress firewall from a strong security perspective, not because of any conceptual limitation, but because of implementation limitations we have today. We're not willing to make that as a strong assertion. But over time, it could become that. And it probably makes sense for it to become that, right? So you can kind of consider this as a simplistic layer 7 egress firewall that is defined in terms of the available set of services that you can reach. And if they're not defined, you can't reach them.
2 comments here. One, that we are moving with the CNI, which will provide the infrastructure.
Right, so CNI is an incremental step to making that more viable.
And even today, I mean, we discussed in the past how we can enforce the egress by using network policies, using network policy and using the egress gateway. So technically it is difficult, but it is already kind of possible to enforce.
Yes, we can certainly enforce
we have to.
A reasonable subset,
Yeah.
Possibly all of the basic Kubernetes network policy on ingress today. Using RBAC rules.
And on egress by preventing direct traffic outside and forcing everything to egress, like was proposed, I think.
Yes, so that it is in general heading in that direction. I was quite careful not to duplicate the functionality from Kubernetes network policy egress rules, right? So this is intended to be a kind of layer 7 declaration. It's a higher level representation. So you could have both at the same time and both could be in effect. Right, you could have Istio and Calico running, Istio and Cilium running, or Istio and some other CNI-based implementation of Kubernetes network policy. And there'll probably be some discussion in the long run about when you need one, when you need the other, when you need both. And I think that's something that we can resolve over time. But we do need the ability to kind of declare this dependency at the service level in order to be able to scope the configuration of the network. The other piece of the other thing that we do in here, and so I show some example syntax, and I don't claim that the ingress syntax here is finalized, so we could just debate the structure. The other thing that we do is we declare a kind of scoping constraint on the declarations that we have in our own APIs that affect basically whether services are visible only within a namespace within which they're declared, or whether they're available to be referenced by another namespace. So this has a number of effects. One, it obviously allows people to constrain the network so that, say, if I have a database in a namespace and is only intended to be consumed by a job that I also run on my namespace, then I don't have to expose it to anybody else because I can make it private, which makes the network narrower and leaves us, it's a natural constraint on the network. That means that other namespaces don't see things they couldn't use, not even that they are, it's not just because of reachability, it's because the owner had the intent of not making it exposed at all. This has the general effect of making namespaces more independent, right? In theory, I can declare the same service in 2 distinct namespaces. They're both private. They would never know about each other, right? So they can more independently operate while independently claiming the same part of the network namespace. I can declare the same host.
One tiny note here, that also happens to solve the problem of ports, I mean, of stateful sets and ports, where different namespaces claiming the same port create a lot of problems today.
Yes.
So by isolating and making it private, it's pretty much solved.
Yeah, so the general direction here is by making namespaces more independent, only the things that are contractual between namespaces, essentially when namespace A exposes a service to another namespace, are a more global set of constraints, do a more global set of constraints need to be applied. This is likely to prove useful for modeling egress, right? And I gave an example in the bottom of the document. And so this scoping mechanism applies equally to service entry and virtual service. And there are a couple of quirks here that I drive into the details of, but they're mostly just for rare behaviors, like what happens when we have to merge conflicting destination rules, etc. But those are expected to be uncommon cases as opposed to common cases. Obviously, this making namespaces more independent, right, has some bearing on whether namespaces are tenancy units or not, right? And that might be relevant to some people, right? I think the Cloud Foundry folks had some, right, utility around namespaces being independent units of administration. This would facilitate that. There's still the ability for a top-level admin control. There's a note here about how a kind of cluster-wide or mesh-wide administrator would impose defaults and constraints in the system, which we can get into the details of. So hopefully that does a reasonable job summarizing what's going on, what are the motivations, and what are the long-term impacts of this type of change. So at this point, I should probably just open up to questions. And rather than going through the attached questions in the doc, maybe we just kind of repeat them here as people want to bring them up.
How do you imagine the namespace scoping interacting with multiple clusters or remote clusters? The stuff we've been talking about in past meetings.
So we have kind of two idioms, right, for multi-cluster Istio, right? One is that the mesh is global, right? All the namespaces are the same namespace no matter where they run, right? So if you have namespace in cluster A, namespace in cluster B, they're the same thing, at least from a security and administrative point of view.
And services too.
Yeah, services, network names, etc. So that, we have that other doc which talks about kind of global mesh versus federated meshes. So in that world, that would be the global mesh, right? Where it's the workload location doesn't really matter as far as the administration policy goes.
And that corresponds to the model where you want replication across regions and you want redundancy and everything else, which is a very extremely common use case.
Right, but the assumption is that the namespace means the same thing no matter which cluster it's in.
Yes, it's semantically equivalent no matter where it is.
It's a unit of isolation. That's a central unit, not necessarily where it's running, in which particular location is running. It matters that it's in a particular namespace.
Yeah.
Could we add another enum like mesh instead of public or private, which means it's public for this mesh but not for other meshes?
So we can obviously add other enums, and I was very careful to use enums here instead of booleans. But I'd like to see more justification.
Yeah.
Right. Right. So
because we had decided that, as such, Istio would actually be a single mesh solution, and then everything else would actually be built on top of that in terms of APIs that we would actually add and so on. To that extent, exposing something like cross mesh and so on will just percolate that federation concept and so on and so forth into everything else, and then the implications are not really clear in terms of how that.
So there's obviously the discussion today around how to bind services to gateways, particularly in the context of the zero VPN solution.
I would say that this is kind of, it's not clear what are the requirements here.
Yes,
it's only one big mesh, one internet and a mesh. I mean, you should not consider other meshes as, it's either one mesh or it's internet.
Well, it depends, right? So
okay.
You may want to have multiple meshes as well.
Right,
we haven't really looked into that.
But then they don't share the unit of administration, right? They don't exist in the same configuration space.
Yeah, they're completely different. From my mesh point of view, there is only my mesh and the internet.
But does this proposal assume that the namespace means the same thing no matter which cluster it's on?
Yes, because it's part of the same configuration domain.
Well, maybe, because you can still express. I mean, the naming of the namespace can still be refined, and you can still have a namespace full qualified with something else to. I mean, we can still express somehow the model of two clusters, same namespace but different entities. But
not by writing the same configuration into the
Not
same
by writing the-
namespace into
no.
both, right?
No,
So
by-
that's why it's not the same administration domain.
by mangling somehow at
Right, but that's an
implementation level,
an
yes.
external system.
Yes, but with an external system, yes, we could support a case where you are in a situation where same namespace name happens to be mapping, whatever.
Right, but because this is configuration, right, it belongs to the administrative domain.
Yeah.
So we have to be very careful about that. Now, could we have other enums? Yes. I don't know. I'd like to see a stronger justification for adding any. The one that was discussed was, because public basically means export this service outside my namespace so someone else can consume it. You could, in theory, put a constraint on that export to say who you're allowed to export to or who you want to export to. That seemed like something we could add later if it was necessary, and it wasn't clear that it was immediately added any value beyond what Ingress controls would add.
Well, unless it is a mandatory control where you can specify public and you can specify a list of namespaces where you are exported, and that is constrained to mean that nobody else can see it. And I think that will also address that.
Yeah, so that I was careful to that could be additive.
Yeah.
But we didn't have to necessarily do it in the first version. And I put a note.
Oh, no, I agree. I mean, it's but.
Yeah, so the only other scope that was discussed was mesh. And what mesh meant was that no matter what anybody else did, it was always in every namespace. But we have a alternative solution for that, which is to basically have admin control over a shared configuration namespace and then use a flag or something to elect that namespace as the default, which is an interesting topic in and of itself.
So I have a question about that. Are you imagining that in that default namespace, virtual services and service entries can exist as well?
Yes.
Because it doesn't say that in the section that talks about
thought
that.
of a global shared import space. Think of it as like a shared base class that everybody imports from. I mean, like everything that you put in there will get inherited to everybody else. And then on top of that, you add things that are specific to the namespace. So for example, everything depends on Istio, the Istio telemetry and Istio policy as a service to talk to. And also they probably also depend on Prometheus and so on and so forth. These are things that you can actually add in that default namespace that everybody else would actually inherit that. On top of that, you add the additional dependencies within the namespace.
And on top of that, we have the second, I think it's still in the proposal, we have the second overrides namespace, where you specify things that you cannot necessarily replace in your namespace.
Well, yeah. So the goal with any default configuration namespace, right? One that the admin says this is the global set of defaults, right? It has to merge per standard merge semantics with the resources that are scoped at the namespace level. And in the case of something like Egress, right, it would be a union, right? You couldn't remove them. In the case of Ingress,
but you can override or replace or tune.
Well, no, it's
or
union,
merge.
so you can't.
Merge, okay.
It's merge.
Merge.
And in the case of Ingress, it's because it's an ordered execution, it's concatenation, right? Which means the global one takes precedence. Now, that seems reasonable as a general pattern. We have to kind of go through in a domain by domain basis to see if that pattern holds across all of the API resources that we have. Right, that's an important property. But if that property holds, then it avoids us having to create other types in the API to model these concerns. And we have a large enough API footprint right now that we want to try and actually make it smaller, not bigger. Right, we don't want to. The choice for this would either to be elect a namespace as the default and put services, service entries, these rules in there, or you create cluster level CRDs for each of those types, and those are now, as far as Kubernetes is concerned, different APIs.
Yeah.
And that would become a bit of a maintenance headache.
No, I agree. No, I was just saying that having this namespace with defaults can also be paired with a namespace with overrides where user cannot actually mess with them and merge.
Yeah, it's possible that we could have
That's,
other tiers, but I think
it's an important use case because many people want to have strict control. I want to say that you can only connect to this and with these settings. You cannot actually merge it.
well, the union for egress has precedence because it's ordered, so you can't override.
But there needs
Wait. So if something is in the default namespace, then every namespace automatically imports all those things?
Yes. Which would, for egress, that would mostly be used for infrastructural concerns.
But why
Now,
is that?
the real question is whether you want to be able to override it, to reduce the scope of that, not to increase it.
In Kubernetes, the default namespace is in no way more special than
No,
other
no, no.
namespaces.
Right.
It's not the same with the
This is not the same.
So you were not talking about
No,
default Kubernetes
It's Istio
namespace.
defaults. It's admin specifying.
Okay,
how to
let's
connect
call
to
it
Google.
differently, please, because
Yeah, I don't care what the name is.
yeah, but
So
let's
let's leave
talk
that aside.
about
Or the
it
shared
differently.
namespace.
Shared namespace.
Yeah.
So it's the Istio config namespace.
Sure.
Where we would put Istio pilot, Istio telemetry, Istio.
No, it's different.
That's Istio
It's different from
system.
the runtime components because the runtime components actually have behaviors that you don't want to share with everybody else.
But how do you expose the mixer? How do you import Istio mixer into the namespace? of
Right,
the-
it could be in the config one.
No, is this
Mixer can run in one namespace, but the
Oh yeah, no,
configuration.
Istio definitely will run a different namespace.
Yes,
but the
yes,
idea
so that's
that
the point. I'm just trying to say Istio system is different from Istio config.
Yes. Oh yeah, it definitely is different. I mean, in the sense that Istio mixer and everything else run Istio system, but somehow you need to import the definition of Istio mixer, and that don't necessarily need to put the Istio mixer definition there, but it behaves like
It probably
You
do-
could.
it probably
What do you
wouldn't be
mean
that
by
expensive.
definition of Istio mixer? Like
So
which
The service
definition?
entry pointing
how
to
do
it.
you know? How do you connect to Istio mixer?
Oh, I see. That's not
You
the.
don't want to define one in each
Yeah.
namespace.
So that's different.
When namespaces are isolated, you no longer see Istio mixer because it's an Istio system, which doesn't mean anything.
So yeah, so we have a little bit of validation work to make sure that it works for all those standard deployment scenarios, but so far it seems like it's
Okay.
fine
Absolutely.
in terms of validating the API.
So which one is the global one? I guess I'm a little bit confused. Is the mesh network policy the global one? And then you can specify a namespace specific policy that's kind of does addictive action to it for egress?
Right, so imagine you had there's a namespace that is the global default namespace, whatever you want to call it, Istio config. And every namespace would inherit that mesh network policy. And it would be merged with a mesh network policy that was defined in their namespace. Right, so we don't have
Merger, or you said
it's
you talked about
merge.
override.
merge.
Overriding.
Right, the merge semantics have to be well defined. It's always merge. Right, the merge can be override, the merge can be concatenate, the merge can be union.
So this would be like if I'm an administrator for a group of developers who may be in charge of many services, let's say 50 services, I may have 50 team to develop these services, so I can apply global policy that I would be able to say, these are the things I want to set aside for my team, and these are the flexibilities I can allow them. And then these are the things that I definitely don't expect them to access. So would we
Right,
have
so
the
you-
capability to say, these are the things I don't want them to break, and these are the things
Well,
they
like
have toggle room to configure?
within the
themselves?
context of this API, right, an admin would have the ability to write an ingress rule that would say, don't allow any external traffic to reach these pods, right? And then that would apply globally.
Right. I'm trying to understand how your merge would work to not allow override with certain cases to allow override.
For example, you can define a gateway for example.com in the global namespace and map it to one particular cluster, and that will mean that nobody else in a namespace can take over that name. I mean, I think that's
Well, so there's a variety of situations, right? So one, I want to make sure that this is very clearly separated from admission control. Right? You can always use admission control to constrain a namespace owner from performing a bunch of actions. And we have a separate proposal, right, about using a policy document that constrains the ability of a namespace owner to declare certain network names. Right, so you can use that to constrain. Now, there's some debate about how much utility that provides.
and how much overlap exists with this mechanism, because this mechanism also provides a way to control.
Yeah, I think it's the conjunction of the two proposals that's confusing to me. Like what are the scenario you would use which one?
Right. So the issue we have today that this doesn't solve is, while it constrains the ability of a namespace owner to write an artifact that impacts another namespace owner, it doesn't constrain the ability of the namespace owner to write an artifact that impacts themselves. Right, that's the distinction between the two things. Right, so if
But do we need to provide that? Because then,
right, so that,
what's the meaning of an owner in that case, right?
Right, so there's a discussion here to be had about, is that delta worthwhile addressing in the API?
But even before it's worthwhile, I mean, it brings into question, what does an owner mean? Because if I'm an owner, I can't write anything that impacts myself, right? So,
right, so I think that's the crux. Like the canonical use case we have here is Ingress, right? So you have some admin who owns the physical Ingress gateways. They own the proxy, and they own the host name. Let's say apple.com, right? And then they want to say, I want other namespaces to be able to define pieces of apple.com, right?
Right. Like product page, review.
Right. Now the traffic ownership RFE granted rights to namespaces to own paths of apple.com. The other way is to say, look, I, the owner of the gateway, I'm only going to import apple.com definitions from 5 of the 5,000 namespaces in the mesh, right? Because I will take those service entries that are declared public from those 5 namespaces, I'll perform virtual service merge on them, and those are the ones I'll load, right? And so I can prevent another namespace from declaring something in apple.com and impacting the gateway, right? So it's managing the authority by namespace reference as opposed to by partitioning the network namespace.
So this proposal does not contradict the traffic governance proposal, but it complements it.
It certainly complements it, and there is an open question about whether the additional traffic RFE proposal is necessary if we have this.
In other words, another alternative to, in a way.
Right. So there are 2 ways of
the RFP is required, right? Because then, like, if this model constrains you to saying only the namespace owner can define something X or Y, and I don't see a way by which this model is telling you this namespace owner can declare X or Y as an exported service, which actually can be imported by somebody else. In other words, we need something to constrain the imports. Right. And that's where the RFE, that traffic ownership thing comes in, right? Well, I mean, it's not more of a traffic ownership, it's more of a traffic import thing. Where
no. This does constrain that, Sriram. Yeah. The only distinction here is, right, if I import apple.com from n namespaces, right, then the only thing that's not constrained is their definition of apple.com.
No, not the private one, the public one. If I declare...
Yeah, no, I'm talking about the public one. Right? There are 3 namespaces, and that one owns apple.com/sales, one owns /store, and one owns /support, right? If I trust those namespaces to never deviate from the piece that they own, then I'm fine, right? I'll only import those, so I can't have a rogue namespace inject stuff into the gateway that I own.
Are you suggesting that you choose the namespace to import rules from, and you'll merge any rules that are defined in those namespaces?
Yeah.
Maybe with some additional constraints. I mean, maybe not.
That sounds sort of scary.
Well, with additional constraints, it's not so scary. I mean, you can explicitly specify which part.
Right. So there's 2 things, right? So today, Shannon, without the traffic RFE stuff, we are importing everything, right? It's global. So that's already problematic, right? So this is strictly better than that, because at least I can control who I'm willing to trust, right? Right. Because namespaces are trust domains, right? They have owners and admins, right? They have identities. So I am delegating to them. When I'm not delegating, I'm not being very precise about the subdivision of the network namespace I'm delegating to them.
But we can be.
But I am trusting them to some degree or other, right? Because I'm saying, basically, I'm going to take your definition, and whatever your definition says is going to happen.
No, but we can make it more strict. I mean, you can specify you can only take over apple.com/product page.
Right. And
No,
the
but
other
I
thing is-
think Louis' point is right that since this is actually more of an import model where you have full control over what impacts you don't really care what others have declared that conflicts with what your points of view are. You can decide to just override it and just declare your own local version of apple.com, and that's it.
if they violate my trust, I will not import them anymore.
This is the same as programming. Within PL, we import packages and so on and so forth. And if somebody overrides thing and somebody just declares conflicting names, I mean, we have to resolve it, or we stop importing that package. Right? So it's, I guess, yeah.
So by importing, do you guys mean create the service entry? That's what I'm confused. How are you importing
the shortcut think of it as a shortcut for service entry. You can just simply say import the namespace, and everything in that namespace will get imported within Pilot.
It's up, yeah.
So the granularity is at the namespace level, but in theory, it could also be at the service center level, or some other finer grain or URL or path, right?
Yeah. So I constrained it here to just namespace, host, IP, and port. But we could add more refinement here if we wanted to.
So are you expecting people to do this even for product page and different services within apple.com within the same cluster though?
Yes.
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 To give one small comment here. So in apple.com really is owned by you have an IP address and a certificate. Whichever namespace runs the gateway with that IP address and certificate is the only real owner of apple.com. And with this mechanism, they can delegate where exactly stuff goes, but ultimately it's a certificate IP address mapping that defines at DNS level, at least, apple.com.
Right.
Yeah, so I mean, I think this kind of illustrates the idea that calling this network policy and having it in egress is not really giving people the right sort of mental model of what's going on here. When you have egress namespace equals NS2, what I'm saying is basically import all host names from namespace 2. Import every virtual service that has in namespace 2. Import every service entry in namespace 2.
That is public.
And yeah, every public thing that is in namespace 2. Not sort of allow traffic from my workload to now reach namespace 2, although that may be the sort of ultimate effect. But I think that we would get if we sort of presented it to users that way of this is how you import names into your configuration or import names into your workload, that would be a much clearer mental model and sort of also separate it out from this kind of RBAC access control.
Right. So that was Spike and I talked a little bit about this yesterday. Obviously, the ingress and egress stuff in here, right? It's not symmetric like the way Kubernetes network policy is defined, right? Generally speaking, we expect the egress rules to be more coarse-grained than the ingress ones because you don't get fired for getting your egress wrong. Mostly, you get fired for getting your ingress wrong, right? Because you haven't locked down the services that you're responsible for. Gateway is an interesting side one here. In the long run, though, right? I mean, as long as we have network control and those are the only things that are basically endpoints that are reachable by the network, it does act like a firewall in the sense that it prevents you from talking to anything else. The terminology might feel a little different, but it effectively will act like that over time. The only reason why we're not making that assertion now is because
that is true.
Keep in mind that it's only partially true because this is effectively implicitly assuming that we are trapping all traffic, and that is the only way by which everything would actually work.
So that was the constraint, right, that I laid out at the beginning, Sriram.
Right, and so the point being that if we were to expand the scope of the system to something where you can use HTTP proxy or a connect proxy and so on, where you explicitly talk to the proxy in order to talk to the external world, then it actually becomes more of a proxy visibility thing and not more of a firewall thing, because in that case, I can choose to talk to somebody directly. I just won't get the benefits of the mesh. But if I choose to talk to the proxy, then I get the benefits of the mesh. So
So it's not always a firewall. That is true. It is sometimes a firewall.
Which is probably why we're
and it's doing more than a firewall is the other thing. So because what's going on is that you're not just importing, or you're not just saying I'm allowing workloads to make a connection to this host. You're also saying, I'm going to import all virtual services and all routing rules that are hung onto that host name. So what's going on here is not, it's like basically telling users this is a firewall, I think is going to lead them down the wrong path of understanding. Because what we're saying is, it's more like an import statement at the top of your program. Go grab this network name and get me all the config for it from this namespace.
I also
Maybe it might be worthwhile to just rename this to something else. But then the ingress will not actually match.
Yeah, and I think we should split out the ingress anyway. I think it's a bad idea to have this RBAC next to the egress because they're making very different promises from a security perspective, and they have really different rules about how you would merge them. And it also means that you can't sort of split off access control as a different module than this kind of service visibility stuff. So like
Right,
Calico,
so, yeah, so
we do access control, and it is useful for us to be able to say, you can choose the Istio RBAC or you can choose Calico access control, and have that be a different thing than this kind of service visibility.
Well, this will be combined with the Kubernetes traffic policy. So at IP level, you control the IP as a traffic policy, and this is the L7. Routes, host names, and the high level.
Right, but the point here is that we should not mix policy and routing. It's like
Well, remember there is no difference logically at layer 7 between IP accessibility and path-based routing, right? All you're doing is declaring control over a more fine-grained definition of the network. Right? There's no logical distinction there. Now, I buy Spike's argument about, look, the egress stuff has slightly different or softer semantics in certain scenarios, and so the administration requirements over them may be different than over the ingress stuff. Right? I buy that as an argument for separation. In the long run, right, we still want to give the impression that people can use this stuff as a firewall, right, if they set themselves up for it.
I think that's true, but that's not the same thing as presenting it as a firewall.
Right,
like telling users, here's this thing, you can use it for access control if you make sure that all the traffic goes to the proxy, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, so I think
is a good place to be compared to this is a firewall.
Right, so I think, I don't want to use terms like import, which don't allow for that concept to be part of the nomenclature. So naming is part here.
I think dependency sounds good to me.
I thought about scope.
Yeah, scope or dependency as a way to talk about this.
But the nice property of this is that it's symmetrical and consistent with traffic policy. So people who are familiar with traffic policy and who are used to put policies at level 3 will find this a bit more intuitive than alternative.
Yeah. So I'm fine going either way. The only other thing I would point out is the unit of edit is probably the same. The owner, the person who would create this resource is probably the same person. Right? If you split it into 2, they'll just create both. It's not necessarily that bad, but we have had feedback about how often we make people create 2 resources when they could create 1.
And we lose the consistency with the other.
Well, there's obviously a pro and con there. Right? So we're not a hard firewall.
Yeah, I don't think that consistency actually exists.
It's logically necessary. For instance, right now, the destination rule has too many logical concepts in it, and it's problematic. I had a discussion this morning with Sriram. So we should really not worry about how many resources they are, but whether it makes sense or not to have them separate.
Well, and that mostly ties around who does the work.
Exactly.
And the ownership.
Yeah, but even as an owner, I may want to create 2 different resources if that makes sense to me.
Right,
Maybe I want to impose different semantics.
The structural reason then is I want 2 different administrators to own that domain. That's at least part of the reasoning. It's not the only reasoning, but it's part of it.
But so you don't have to align by administrative access on a per resource basis. It could actually be things like, even if I was use a simple GitOps thing, I would be frequently updating the egress aspects as my service grows and consumes more. But the ingress would actually remain the same. But if I were to impose some form of access control saying only this person can edit, then it actually becomes a bottleneck because I would have to audit each and every change that in the entire resource just to see that, this is only for the egress and,
Yeah, so Sriram, I buy the argument. They may actually have slightly different administrative life cycles, and that would mean that they should be split. Yeah. And that you might make the parallel argument that Kubernetes traffic policy has should itself be split because its egress rules are likely to evolve in a different rate than its ingress rules, or be subject to different security reviews or things like that. So I don't have a problem with that. That's just nomenclature, and it's very easy to make the split.
And we can call it Istio or ingress traffic policy and egress traffic policy.
Or we can call it
whatever. Yeah,
like
we can split it easily.
network scope, and
yeah, so
that's fine.
So the trade-off is between consistent with traffic policy and separated. Yeah.
Okay, so
Flip a coin.
if people want to weigh in on that issue, just did Spike, you make a comment about this in the doc?
Yeah, I did.
Okay, so just if you have a strong opinion either way, I'm honestly flexible about this. I just want to make sure we have good, sensible naming. I'm happy if it seems like there's some consensus to split. So absent any more feedback, that's what I'll go and do. But if there's some other feedback in the doc, then I'll go take a look.
There are a bunch of comments on that deny. I mean, if we want to start to deny or just start with allow and implicit deny, and later if necessary.
Right, but that's how our RBAC is set to a standard implicit deny, standard in line with standard firewall rules. So I guess this is just more of a typo, but the point that it echoes even more here, that the mental model that people have or come with is one where they would look at this and they'd be like deny all, but then
but the traffic policy in Kubernetes has the same kind of default to allow to deny, and so if you specify a rule, you implicitly have default deny, and it's easier to merge. That's kind of
so by default, if nothing is specified, it's still allowed.
If you don't have any rule whatsoever, it's allowed.
It should be allowed.
But if you specify any rule if you specify a rule, then automatically it becomes default deny, and the rules are combined with.
It's actually not about specifying a rule. It's about whether or not a policy exists that selects that workload.
Yes.
Right.
So you could have a policy that was empty, had 0 rules in it, but if the selector for the policy selects your workload, then that workload is now moves from being default allow to default deny.
Right. It should also make sense for people who don't want to necessarily impose any scoping in the beginning. They're just trying Istio and they don't want to configure too many things, right? So it should work for them.
No, that's consistent, but that's kind of the same. Anyway,
so one thing, I don't want to get too much in the weeds on the ingress stuff, because if we're going to split this, we're going to come back and have a separate review anyway with Lehman. And there was obviously one of the big questions with ingress and ordered rules is how we would do merging with global level admin defaults, right? And prioritization, and I think there's going to be some refinement of that discussion.
And ingress also overlaps with the 2 other proposals, so we need to kind of put them together.
So I had one other thing I wanted to ask about in terms of this traffic scoping stuff. I got the impression from reading the document that this egress stuff only applies to sidecars. It doesn't apply to gateways.
No, this applies to gateways too.
Okay.
Right. So if you look in the document, right, I explicitly say that gateways can be made public, and that if you want to bind a virtual service to a gateway, you must have brought it in.
Sorry, must have brought the virtual service in?
No, the gateway. Because virtual service.
So I think actually it should be the other way around. That the person who is operating the gateway needs to import the virtual service in their egress mesh policy.
So you have to do both, right? So gateways are referenceable resources, right? Virtual services refer to them by name.
Yeah, and I think that's also the wrong way around.
Yeah, maybe we can relax this part. And basically,
well, we might be able to relax that, but we can't turn the API instantaneously for that.
What I'm saying
I know we can't turn it instantaneously, but I think the model that I have is that the gateway owner imports the virtual service name and then binds that virtual service to their gateway. Right now, it's the virtual service being bound to a gateway.
Remember, Spike, within routing rule, we have to have the ability for some routes to not be gateway bound and some to be gateway bound. And we don't split that by resource, we split that by host name. So we don't have the ability to do that precisely the way you would want right now within the existing virtual service API.
I think.
So I guess this is where the traffic ownership comes, right? Because if you decide to import one or more virtual services, put it another way, right? The gateway does not necessarily have to be a service in the registry. It could effectively run as a separate set of pool of Envoy somewhere, and it's just consuming configurations. In that case, being able to define this per namespace level thing would actually be slightly problematic, but we could work around that as such. So
right now, we're proposing to add the ability for a virtual service to bind itself to a gateway that's in a completely different namespace.
Yes. If it imports that gateway and that gateway is public.
So that's something we already have. I mean, that's how the API works.
Right, that's currently how it works. Yes.
And with this proposal on top of it, if the gateway, whatever the gateway is defined, has the egress section and imports that namespace,
that's the point. A gateway does not have an egress section. A gateway is like, I mean, as a workload.
Remember, Sriram, gateway is a logical workload.
The gateway deployment, the ones that has IP address certificates and everything else, the actual deployment. In that namespace, you have the egress specification. You specify that egress that gateway workload can only connect to those namespaces in the list.
I guess that was my point, that like, will we always be enforcing the fact that the gateways have to be a service in the registry, such that we can actually
it's not that it's a service in the registry, it's that it's a workload.
It's a workload, that's true.
And if the gateway is constrained to a specific set of egresses, of namespaces, then obviously nothing else can affect that workload. I mean, if the gateway cannot talk with a namespace, there is no point for definition in that namespace to bind to the gateway.
So how does that work in this case? Because as a gateway, if you take the model where people are exposing services from their respective namespaces, we would have to declare effectively the gateway imports all namespaces in some way.
No. You declare the namespaces that are imported, and then if you see any definitions that binds to that gateway and is not matching the egress, you either report an error or ignore.
Okay,
what I'm saying is more like, think of it as the API gateway model, where I'm talking about more of a common use case with what people would do, which is that if we were to use this for the gateways, then if I have a service per namespace where each namespace is exporting a service, then I would effectively have to, every time a new service is being created in a particular namespace, I would have to update not just the namespace, also update the gateway in order to say that you're going to be importing this. And so it's that's probably
that's common.
That's
that based on the current design, you have to keep updating, which is confusing, because today I don't have to specify this egress thing if I don't care about it. As I grow my more services, I can
remember. Then you can always import star, right? You can import all namespaces if you want to, as the gateway owner. So you have a get out. Right, but most of the time what we see is the gateway owner only trusts a few namespaces to define the host that they want to export, right?
Okay, so you can do star, which would be backwards compatible as
yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. So can you actually change this egress here to import and export? Because while listening to it, it's very hard to understand when people talk which ingress you're talking about. And by the way, gateway is a type of ingress already. So when you talk about ingress, export, import, I see, it's very, very confusing to listen.
The names are based on what traffic policy defines. That's
right. So we just talked about
traffic policy.
Kubernetes network policy. That's why we use the terms ingress and egress. If we choose not to align with it, which if we're going to split the resource apart, there's not much point aligning with it, then we can choose different names.
But if we align them,
but then we have to pick the names. Import and export, dependency, scope, there's a variety of options.
What's the benefit in aligning at this sort of name level?
Because we provide similar functionality. We provide level 7.
Because it's semantically close.
Yeah, but it took me a while to figure out.
I don't think the name matters here.
Well,
sorry, Lynn, what was that?
Yeah, it reused the egress and service entry. It took me a while to figure out too.
But it actually matches what we're using for egress, because what we define in Istio as egress in the past, that's exactly what this is doing. I mean, it's defining.
Yeah, but conceptually, we have been rooted. That's been configuring going out of the cluster.
Exactly.
But egress doesn't mean out of cluster. It also means out of the workload.
It means so many things that if we could actually use export, which is not used anywhere else, and this is about important export of names.
We can have multiple proposals and vote on names. That's fine. I mean, naming is not the most important thing.
Well, it is. In a discussion, it's actually just listening to you. I've been listening, and it's very hard to understand what you're talking about because of this confusion of names.
Obviously, I can't update it now.
Yeah.
I will go update it offline. Spike, did I reasonably answer your question about gateway?
I guess I'm still unclear why the gateway can't be the the thing that points to the virtual service rather than the virtual service the other way. But we can take that offline.
Okay. So
I mean, you answered the question about whether or not the gateway owner gets to write an egress, or like an egress, what's on the screen right now, policy that determines whether or not people can add themselves to.
It was actually more about the ability of the virtual service to tailor the routing based on whether it was attached to the gateway or to a sidecar in context.
Right. So if you don't specify the gateway, the virtual service is attached to the mesh, so it applies to all the sidecars.
No, I mean I understand that, but I still think that the gateway owner should be the one who's kind of pulling the trigger, saying, okay, I'm going to take this virtual service and this virtual service and this virtual service.
But then the issue becomes, like, if I'm the owner of the backend service that's receiving traffic, right? Usually I'm the one defining the virtual service that's doing the routing to those backends. And if I want to vary the behavior between the edge gateway and the internal one, right, then either the options are I put an attribute in the API that says that, right? The virtual service, because that's really what it does, right? You can imagine the gateway reference in virtual service is saying that there's a filter that either this works or this doesn't work in this context, right? Just like label selector in some way. But right now we only have one unit of edit per host name, per namespace. And if I wanted to say that I, as the backend owner, could write one for a gateway and one for a mesh, then we'd have to support two, and that would affect the API versioning story.
I'm a bit confused because if you look at the last example here with namespace and host and translate it to an ingress equivalent, I think you get exactly what you asked for. I mean, you as a gateway owner, you can specify what namespace and what host you egress to, isn't it?
Yeah, so this does give the ability for the gateway owner to refer to a virtual service declaration in any particular namespace. But there's still an additional level of control that namespace owner has on routing.
But this imports everything in that namespace, and I think what's
it only imports that host.
Last section.
Okay.
It would clarify things for me if you wrote this down as an example.
Yes.
Yeah, so I can expand the gateway example and talk about the ownership model and what it would mean for sure. So feel free to put a comment somewhere where you'd like to see me expand. I'll go try to do that anyway.
More examples definitely would be wonderful.
So we're running out of time. I think, obviously there's a fair amount of detail, both in terms of the API structure and maybe some of the semantics around some of the use cases. As a broad stroke, is this something people feel like is headed in the right direction or not? And if your answer is abstain because I don't understand it yet and I need to see more detail and more examples, that's a totally fine thing too.
I think we definitely have to leave like some time for people to read through, digest it, think about it.
I think we have to clean this up, and then we basically send a final version of the document that would probably get the right feedback that we want. When we split the ingress and egress part, and then do the proper namings of the shared and the namespace stuff. With some examples, then it probably makes a lot of sense for people, because right now we've corrected a whole bunch of concepts in situ, while talking about this, but it's not reflected in the doc. So for somebody to, only the people who have followed along the entire conversation can actually say, yeah, this is good or not good. Whereas most of them are probably lost somewhere.
And to make it a bit more easier to digest and to understand, I've been working on at least for the egress part on an implementation or a proof of concept, and I'm hoping to get it into 1.1 or whatever, at least to have the visibility and public stuff. So it may be easier to play with something that implements at least part of this too.
So maybe in 2 weeks you can give us a demo then.
Yeah, we can
because
also
if you really target it for that soon, maybe we can see it in action, and it will be just easier.
We can try to do that as well. Yes, that's
right.
I like it.
Yeah. So there is the very immediate and pressing issue, regardless of everything else. And we now have hit the scalability limits of the system with some customers, and we have to address it. There's a forcing function there that's really hard.
Right. So a good example would be to show the graph pruning in action with this API, right? Because
I just don't want to churn people, right? We should be able to resolve on the API as a working group without having Costin to have actually implemented it. Like, it's always
No,
good to
but he
have.
said he has.
Yeah, but there's a
Yeah,
lot
yeah,
of
yeah.
snacks
In
within
principle,
this
right?
that we need to implement properly. So I would much rather like be narrow it on the API first and like understand the impacts and semantics, and then do a proper implementation, because I do not want to get anything that's like, like a prototype version that's like into a release and then worry about backward compatibility.
So maybe rather than getting a demo, maybe Costin, because we kind of have an idea now what graph pruning does to scale and performance. That's the reason why we wrote the reference.
The goal was to figure out if namespace isolation solves some of the scalability problems, and at least with what I have so far, we can go to 3,000, 5,000 services with reasonable deployment time pretty easily.
Maybe give an example of the delta between when we weren't scoping and when we were scoping.
The delta was basically without isolation, my machine was crashing under swap and memory and everything else, and after it took about 10-20 seconds to do a full push to 1,000 endpoints with 3,000 services. So it's pretty significant in terms of performance and latency.
I mean, you can do graph pruning in many ways, right? So this, like, incidentally, this API addresses the graph pruning problem, and we do have a sense of urgency to release a version for doing graph pruning, right?
What is graph pruning?
So graph pruning.
What we discuss here, basically. I mean, the egress.
Okay, hold on. Yeah. Graph pruning means that you don't download to Envoy all the listeners and all the clusters for all the services in the global mesh, but you download only what is necessary.
Okay, great.
And what is necessary could be restricted to using this method. There are other methods.
That's pretty much what this API is proposing in the egress section.
Right. So in this case, you would only push the namespace 2 and namespace 3 to the Egress gateway, because that's all they need.
Yes.
So this is the term used to describe what this proposal is, that the sidecars only get the config that they need, because that is both a security and scalability concern that we've had.
Yes.
Right, right. And they are both fairly stringent, I would say. We've been trying to address this for the past 2 months at least.
So from that perspective, Louis, yes, I think this is going in the right direction. Those are both necessary. We've been working on scalability a lot, and we're looking forward to eventually reaching our scalability targets of 250,000 endpoints in a cluster.
Yes, I would imagine.
Yeah, actually, we're running out of time, and I didn't get my answer. So my answer about the, it's the next topic, which is part of the same theme. And let me actually just share quickly, because we have a GitHub issue. Actually, present now. Hold on. Share.
I can stop presenting.
Okay, let's see. Service entry. All right. So this particular issue was open because we did not make clear to people that service entries are cluster-wide, and I think the API assumes that service entries are cluster-wide. And there was misconfiguration causing some sort of random behavior due to the way we configure cluster and listeners in Envoy. And this whole issue here evolved into a question about the fact that our resources in general networking are not specified whether they are cluster-wide or they are namespace scoped. Mm-hmm. And I would like to know how this proposal would address this question, and whether my current service entries are actually cluster-wide, because we plan to use MCP to map services to service entry. And the service in Kubernetes, at least, it's a namespace thing.
Right.
So I cannot map it to a global service entry, obviously, because if I have two Kubernetes namespaces with two Kubernetes services with the same name in two different namespaces, I would need to map them then to two different service entries.
So Kubernetes services, right, aren't the same host name, right, by definition.
Okay.
But service entries can collide by host name in two different namespaces. So what we're saying is service entries are namespace scoped, but are importable.
Okay. So that changes the current behavior,
Yes,
just
it
to
does
make
now.
it clear. And we
What-
have to fix the code for that,
Right,
because
so
it creates a global listener.
What I described as the upgrade behavior is to maintain the semantics of the current API. The mesh-wide default is import all namespaces.
Okay.
Right, so that's basically saying by default all service entries are public, and all service entries are imported by all namespaces. And then merging occurs.
Mm-hmm.
Right, that's the current behavior. We can change the global default to stop that. Right, there has to be a flag to control that behavior.
Which need to
Hooray.
Yes, just like we want to move away from the import all by default to import none by default. Right, that would be that transition. And then namespaces could define service entries independently, and they would have no impact on each other.
Okay.
And it has to be done, kind of on upgrade, you'll still have the old one, and you need to explicitly turn the flag on because we want to upgrades and
All right.
has to be,
And like by transitivity, the destination rule would be similar, because by using destination rule, I create subsets on a service. So
Right, so
like that's a service entry.
A destination rule is a namespace scoped thing, and it is attached to the service entries which it declares for.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is where merging gets a little bit complicated. If I import two namespaces, they declare the same service entry, and they're decorated by two destination rules that diverge in behavior, right? Then we have to have some resolution.
Including an error.
Okay.
And that could include, you're not allowed to do that.
Yeah.
All right. So can I conclude that the only cluster-wide resource is actually the gateway?
No.
Or like what about the virtual service?
Even gateway is not cluster-wide.
Okay.
Right? I can import, if I want to use a gateway declared in another namespace, I import it through this specification. And then I use its fully qualified name, which is not, by the way, a network name, it's a resource name, to refer to it.
Okay, so the gateway is still like namespace based. However, it works across names. The actual rules can send to backends.
Right. So a gateway in
namespaces.
namespace one can import rules from other namespaces that would then be bound to it.
Okay.
I think for gateway we'll still need to discuss a bit because there are different things. I don't think we considered all the implication for gateway.
There's the dual referencing.
Yeah, that which may be a bit, but
that's more like a filter rule. It's like the RBAC stuff. Like I want this rule to only apply to this workload.
Yeah.
Right. So it's a refinement of an existing rule set, which is in many ways like the match conditions that exist, and the syntax is structurally the same.
If we can avoid defining gateway resources in each namespace, it would be wonderful.
Yeah, no, so the one thing that this does is it avoids the need to create duplicate gateway resources all over the place.
Yeah.
Because you can just use them now.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that actually is clearer, I think.
Okay, so I think that answered my question. Thank you.
Right.
Okay.
Yes, the one headache we have is like we have customers who have to create a gateway just so they can create a virtual service to bind to it, and then they expect all those end gateway resources to be loaded into one physical gateway.
And I think Shreem are very happy with.
And we want to stop doing that.
I know.
Okay. So I think we're really running, we ran over time already. So we'll probably need to stop now, but I do encourage everybody to like provide comments offline in the document, also send emails. I guess that works. If need be, we'll have one more meeting next week if I see like a lot of fires happening, contradictory discussions and everything. We'll try to have one more meeting next week.
Yeah, it might be good to discuss concrete examples next week.
Yeah,
Especially you guys want to get this into 1.1, right?
I mean, and just coming back to a topic from last week, like we talked about how we were going to have a process to make progress on reviews and commit to features. And we said that this, like we outlined what the list of design reviews that needed to occur. And this was number one on the list because it's blocking adoption.
So I will add, the list of design reviews we need to agree on in the meeting notes. Okay.
Yeah. So I'll partition the doc into the things that need to be agreed upon in priority, and the things that don't. Right? They can move basically an addendum, because there is a clear distinction between those two things, and we have a commitment as a working group to try and get this resolved one way or the other.
All right. I also from the current document, I don't understand exactly the intersection with traffic governance, the other two proposals. And it would be great to clarify that because those are also like fairly important. Maybe not as important as graph pruning, but you know.
Right. So the distinction there is network namespace delegation versus namespace delegation as the unit of trust. And is there a meaningful distinction between those two things that's worthwhile? And I think that's an interesting discussion to be had, but that could be separately.
Yeah. So shall we have a meeting next week then?
Probably, yes.
Yeah, and Andrew, it might be good to close out your survey by before the next week's meeting, so we can have some data.
Well, if people like provide, you know, sufficient, if I have a sufficient number of answers, I can close it. But if for now I have just 2 replies, really.
Yeah, maybe
from
ask
from the main contributor. So I really need more input.
Maybe ask April to promote for you because Istio Mesh has like 10K follower on Twitter.
Okay. So April's meeting is next week at 11.
No, not the community meeting, Twitter.
Oh, on Twitter.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Sure. Yeah. Good idea.
Be careful about that, right?
But first, maybe you should add this third option here, this one, because is this about the 2 options for policy, no?
Yeah.
We should add the third one now, since we have.
Yeah, let me take a look at the survey. I think I might need to revise it.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
And hopefully,
I wish I read this before, but okay. So it's actually going to be next Thursday at 10 because at 11 there is April's community meeting, and I don't dare to hijack that. Okay.
All right.
Yeah, makes sense.
All right. Thank you very much.
So
See you next week then.
Thanks.
Bye.